Hello. Oh my God, I got feedback. That's not good.
You're not on mute.
Okay, I am on mute. Okay, I'm just going to turn this off. Well, that was a good start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Thinking. This is the first Thinking that I have hosted in person since we came back to the newsroom, and it's amazing to see so many people both in the newsroom and online. But it's also no surprise, given the quality of the guest. He's one of the stars of the tech universe. Azeem Azhar is one of those annoying people who seems to be good at absolutely everything they do. He's an analyst, he's a founder, he's an entrepreneur, he's a writer, he's a journalist, he's an author, he's a podcaster. Have I missed anything out?
Just move very quickly before I'm found out.
He also has time to sit on our own AI Index advisory board and is a seminal member of our own AI network. He's perhaps best known, though, for writing the Exponential View, which is probably the most influential, insightful tech newsletter around. And he has also just written Exponential, which is a book based on the same themes of tech and society that he explores in his newsletter. If you haven't read it, you should. It's available to purchase outside or in the Tortoise bookshop. And Luke in the chat is posting a link. So there's lots to talk about. In this book, it's all about how we are living through a new era of humanity, where the biggest technology companies have really kind of fundamentally transformed how we are living and how we interact with each other. And the book is not only a very clear insight into how and why that's happened, but it goes further and it offers solutions. And it suggests how our creaking industrial age institutions could adapt to avoid, as Azeem puts it, us all falling face first into the exponential gap. So welcome, Azeem.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Can I just say a little thank you as well myself, which to James and to Alexandra and to yourself for pulling this together. It's really fantastic. And also making it summer today. So when I left the house, I was like, I'm going to wear this polo top because if I don't wear it today, I'm not going to wear it till next year, by which point it will be 6 years out of date. And so this is going to be its sort of last run out in 2021.
I think.
Thank you for that.
Well, that's no problem. There was a colleague of mine, Alex, said today, dress for the weather you want rather than the weather that you get. So before we kick off, just a few housekeeping points. This is a thinking and not a panel discussion, which means that despite the brilliance of our guest, we don't just want to have him and me talking. We want to hear from as many of you as possible, both in the room and online. So if you're online and you've got a point to make and you want to come into the conversation, then write something in the chat. My colleague Luke is hosting the chat. Or if you're in the room, then just stick your hand up or catch my eye and we'll bring you into the conversation. There's a loose no questions rule because we want to hear what you think. But if you've got a point of view, then please contribute because it adds so much to the overall discussion. Okay, so let's kick it off. I was going to ask a kind of easy question to start with, but when we were outside, Azeem said, why don't you challenge me a bit? So, you know, we all know tech's moving fast, right? And we all know that we are struggling to keep up. So what is profound about that argument?
I didn't expect you to answer it quite that way. And just before I do, I just want to thank two more people because the book was quite hard to produce and took a lot of time. But I was really helped by Maria Gavrilov, who ran my research team. And when you read the book, you will see that it spans so many disciplines from psychology through to semiconductors, through to kind of core physics. It's quite a tough ask, and she did a brilliant job. And the editor, Rowan Borchers at Penguin Random House, who, you know, editors are often unseen when it comes to books, but it's fair to say you would be dealing with a much lesser product without his input. And why it gives me some confidence to answer Alexei's question. I mean, I think there are three things to be really skeptical with the argument that I make. The first is that technology can do anything for us. I don't know what should I do.
Sorry, I'm trying to join the Zoom so I can see what the chat is, but okay, I'm just going to switch it off. Sorry.
You've taken me back 21 years to Southwark, a nightclub where it all went wrong. The three things to be skeptical about. So the first is, are things really accelerating? Are core technologies really, really improving? Are things getting faster? And we need to sort of believe that. The second thing is this really different this time round, or is it just like every other techno panic in the past that we've experienced? Maybe not ourselves personally, but the arrival of elevators in tall buildings, or lifts as we call them over here, and this question about whether there really is a sort of a fixed mindset that humans have that makes it hard for us to deal with change. And I think the third thing to be skeptical about in the book is whether what I argue, which is these are systemic changes, these are not point changes, that this is not just about kind of regulating Facebook or stopping Google doing something, but this is a much, much more systemic, deeper question about the way in which we have to organize our societies, or the posh word that I was encouraged not to use, which is political economies. And I think that those are the three kind of points of contention. And in the book, I really do my best to argue that all of those three things really are happening, that we are actually at a point where the pace with which things are changing is faster than we've seen, and we do find it hard to get to grips with. And I'll just give one tiny example of that. So when I was writing the chapter on what happens to work, I referred to a Romanian company called UiPath. And when I put them in the proposal for the book, UiPath was worth a couple of $100 million, and was a sort of small but fascinating business. By the time I started writing the book, I'd had to take that up to $1 billion. By the time I got, and I'm by the way, I'm on target. I didn't miss my deadlines here. By the time I got the sort of first draft in, that 1 billion had changed to 7. By the time I got the final draft in, that 7 had turned to a $10 billion valuation. And then between the final draft and going to press, which is only a matter of a few weeks, UiPath floated on the NASDAQ stock exchange at a $35 billion valuation. So it had increased 35-fold in value, by the way, while I was writing this book, and made me think, like, did I spend my time wisely? And I had to make that change at the last minute. And that was a pretty consistent feature of the research, right? This pace of change now. We thought that the printing press, historians think that the printing press diffused rapidly across Europe, and it took centuries, and it had effects that we're still feeling today. Some of these technologies are moving now, not just within lifetimes, but within planning cycles of even medium-sized businesses. And so I think that we can argue that things are moving faster. I mean, we'll talk about the rest later.
So if you take the idea of the exponential curve as kind of the leitmotif that runs through your book, the concept involves a kind of boring start and then a kind of sudden takeoff.
Yeah.
Can you just talk us through at what point the curve started, where we are now, and how that whole thing works?
So, I mean, an exponential function is, if there are any mathematicians here, this most beautiful thing because it always looks the same at whatever scale you look at it. And even though there looks like there's a kink in the curve, there is no kink. It just depends where you sit. What's important now is that we feel that movement from this point where it's kind of flat up to here. What drives that? What drives that is the compounding improvement in core technologies. So essentially for the last 60 years, every year, the amount of computer power that you get from spending $1 or £1 increases between about 37 to 40%. And that compounds year after year after year. And so over the course of 60 years, you get to this situation where in 1958, for example, IBM spent $150 buying some transistors, single transistors, $150 each. And a transistor is like the fundamental unit of computation. In your Apple iPhone like this, you've got a chip that has got 10 billion transistors. So the price has dropped from about $150 to tenths of a billionth of a cent. And when something gets as cheap as that, we just use lots of it in our economies. And because we use lots of it, we start to build services around it and complementary services and new products. And that is the power of that compounding, and that compounding is happening in other technology areas. It's happening in the area of biology and in energy and in manufacturing as well. And it does start, as you like to say, Alexei, very, very, at a very boring, slow point. But there is a trigger point where a switch starts to happen, and it varies from technology to technology. So the computer industry was the one that got there first. But let's just look at another fascinating topic, which is lithium-ion batteries, which is what we need in electric cars. When they were $1,000 per kilowatt hour, it meant that for a typical electric car, you'd need to spend 90 grand on the battery alone. The price of those has fallen by about 20% every year for 15 to 20 years. So we're now at about $120 per kilowatt hour. And now, buying an electric vehicle is not a matter of flashing your green credentials. It's actually cheaper than owning a petrol car. So then, to your point is, when does that takeoff happen? In Norway, in 2016, about 20% of electric cars sold were electric vehicles. 2021, it's 80%. So in 4 years, you suddenly find yourself running up that curve. And that dynamic, which is, there's a point where the price drops just enough, and I'm afraid it varies industry to industry, for it to suddenly become desirable or feel like it's suddenly become desirable. In reality, people in the industry have been waiting for that moment for sometimes decades.
Okay, and it's interesting to look at these industries that have the exponential growth that you're describing, but what are the sort of the drivers that contribute to such growth? Because I mean, obviously, in some industries, in journalism, if I do journalism for a year, my journalism doesn't get twice as good. So why is it that computer?
I'm looking at James there. Sorry, that's not what he told me when we met over the summer. So,
but what is it about computer chips? Just to take that as an example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is there such a rate of improvement?
It's a really great question. I mean, it was first identified observationally by the founder of Intel, and he realized that the game of computer chips was about getting transistors onto a silicon chip. And they figured out that every time you make a transistor smaller, on the same area, there's a bit of maths here, you square the number of transistors you can get on the chip, because it's 10 times 10, or it goes to 20 times 20. And that's an exponential improvement. And the industry figured out right across the board that's a process that they should coordinate towards and use as a goal. But it turns out that, and what I love about the exponential age, which is the period I think we're in, it turns out that it's actually not just about miniaturizing silicon chips. There's a more generic relationship, which... did anyone here bake bread? Start breaking bread during the lockdown? Nobody here? Somebody did? Yeah. Okay. How was your 6th loaf of bread compared to your first? Better? Better, less mess, less wasted flour. Right, you learned by doing. And you could eat it, right? So the beautiful secret here is that the reason certain products get better and better is because we learn by doing. And in 1936, an aeronautical engineer called Theodore Wright was trying to figure out what happens to the costs of airframes. And he realized that for every doubling of the production of airframes, the unit costs declined by about 15%. And that was because the engineers making them just became more efficient. And efficient is like a fancy way of saying lazy, right? Because basically we all want to take the shortest route to do anything, and that's what happens. And he embedded that in the idea of the learning curve, that effectively, as we produce more types of engineered products, we get better at producing them. We figure out shortcuts, we figure out optimizations, we figure out how to make them more resource efficient. And that lends itself to these kind of rapid improvements. In the case of the computer chip industry, that's manifested through smaller and smaller components, and then growing demand, right? Because the other side of it is, can you quickly grow demand? And we were able to grow demand. And there were 2 other things that help us grow demand. The second thing, apart from learning by doing, is that computers ended up being a little bit standardized, which means that you could generalize their use. They weren't just used in accounting or payroll or the delivery department. They weren't just used in banking or retail and the airline industry. They were used all over the place with general purpose technologies. So that increases the demand, and it constructs that incentive of going down that learning curve. And then the final aspect to all of this is that we started to deliver networks of global trade that expanded markets, and networks of information that allowed people to learn from each other much more rapidly. So hand in hand with the development of the bare bones of silicon chips that are getting more transistors per die, we have the arrival of the internet and of that sort of modern conception of globalization, which is consistent tariffs and containers. The containers arrived in 1965. The key silicon chip arrived in 1971, the Intel 4004. They go hand in hand, and that globalization allows us to expand demand even further, and prices continue to fall.
I mean, we'll get into this more, I think, later on when we talk about companies. But what is the relationship between the sort of trend that you just described, which kind of relates to an industry or a product or a type of product, and the behavior of an individual company or an individual CEO? So I'm thinking, for instance, I don't know, of Jeff Bezos. He's built a $1 trillion company.
Yeah.
He's kept this kind of day one, we're a startup mentality.
Yeah.
How much of Amazon's success, just to take Amazon as an example, is down to that? And how much is it down to the more general rights law network effects that you were describing before?
Well, I think it's a $2 trillion company, isn't it? I mean, he did work hard for that second trillion. There's one of the academics I rely on quite a lot in the book is a wonderful Irish economist called W. Brian Arthur, who's now based in Stanford. And he was one of the people who wrote I think the canonical pieces of academia about what exponential age companies look like. And he realized in the mid-80s that the game for these companies was an all or nothing battle. That whereas in a traditional industrial age company, a Coca-Cola, there's a Coke down there versus Pepsi, or a Unilever versus Procter & Gamble, executives were promoted for battling and winning 0.1% market share of Persil versus Ariel. And what W. Brian Arthur realized and wrote about in the early 80s was that these markets are what we now call winner take all. It's like David Mamet's play Glengarry Glen Ross. First prize is the Glengarry lead, second prize is steak knives, third prize is you're fired, except that the second prize is you're fired, and first prize is world domination. So the battle is much tougher. And he articulates in a paper in 86 and in 96, this is Brian Arthur, that companies like this organize themselves as if around projects, as if they have to fight for their lives. And it had been true for the earlier companies like Intel and Microsoft, and it was certainly true for the way that a business like Amazon runs.
But isn't there an inconsistency? I'm going to bring in some people from the chat because there are some great points being made by Nico McDonald and Neil Patel and Tim Gordon. So maybe we can come to them in a second. But I can't quite get my head around whether or not it's an inconsistency to say, on the one hand, this is a winner-takes-all strategy, and a company can grow so far and so fast that it completely dominates its ecosystem and its environment, and everyone else is just forget about it. Why, at that point, do they need to still kind of keep on going and keep on fighting tooth and nail?
I think that the reason that they do is. So a reason that I give in the book, and a reason that I just realized, the reason that I've just realized, of course, is that they've got to be intensely competitive anyway. So an intensely competitive person doesn't have limits. But the reason they really do it is because they can, and they have an edict to continue to grow their businesses. I mean, that's what their shareholders expect, and they in fact are their own shareholders quite often. When we look at pre-exponential age companies, the orthodoxy was that there was a force of gravity that kept them to a certain size. That force of gravity was that you had to go and get sort of physical resources, whether it was coal or iron or wheat, and that could get progressively more expensive as you sort of kind of bought up the market. The second thing was that you would enter into a world of managerial complexity, that it soon just became too confusing and bureaucratic to run an organization at a particular scale. What's happened with exponential age companies is that they, for a variety of reasons I talk about in the book, they're much, much better at managing past the traditional scale of a company. When you think about how hard it was for BT, the Albertel phone company, to run a sports TV channel, and yet you have Amazon, which is notionally a bookseller, running an airline internally and making its own TV shows, and you think, well, there's something different about those two. So they figured out how to do that. But the second thing is that many of these exponential age companies have what are known as network-based businesses. And a network-based business is one where the more customers you have, the more valuable your business is to other customers. When Facebook used to be fun, it was more fun when there were 10 million people on it than when there were 10,000, right? Because it's just more of your relatives and your friends and your old mates and sort of, old girlfriends and boyfriends you could stalk. But at 10 people, Facebook is just, not a ton of fun. And that's just so different to an industrial age company. No one shows up to EasyJet to be delighted to hear that the flight's overbooked, right? But that's what a network externality business looks like. In other words, as they get bigger, they get better, and they generally get better for the end customer. And that is what propels them to a certain scale.
Okay, great. Can we bring in Nico McDonald, if he's around?
Hi there.
Hey.
Hi, Nico.
Hi, Azeem. How are you doing?
Very well. Nice to hear from you.
Nico, you're talking about improving the lot of mankind. What do you mean? Can you hear me? Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Do you want to make your point to Azeem?
Yeah, well, actually, I just wanted to pick up on a point about innovation generally. And I think I'm very worried about the term exponential. I think I probably said this to Azeem when he launched the newsletter, that not least after COVID, the term exponential has been rather abused, not by him, but by others. But we do tend to see a sort of inevitability about the way that technologies develop. And I made the point that anyone who says that technology drives ignores the fact that humans are really the driver of change, and human desire for improvement, quality of life, human ingenuity, and so on. And there are hundreds of technologies which have never flourished because we found no use for them. And I think to see an inevitability about a technology, when Noyce and co at Bell Labs in 1947 in Murray Hill, New Jersey, invented the transistor, they didn't know what the hell it was for. I mean, they were just researchers in an overfunded research lab, and they could never have thought about the transformation that the transistor would facilitate with our ingenuity. So I think I think we need to think about the things that failed, and the exponential idea of exponential companies. Standard Oil completely dominated the oil extraction, refining, and distribution business in 1900. Rockefeller was the king, and maybe there weren't that many Rockefellers. There was a Carnegie. He was pretty dominant too. His company led to US Steel, which was a dominant steel maker until only 40, 50 years ago. So I do wonder, is there a qualitative difference between now and then, or is it just a quantitative difference?
What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think there were two different points there. So thank you, Nico. The first point I think is really salient, which is that we do try to drive technologies, and I think it's been a really easy get out of jail card for the tech industry over the last 50 years to argue that technology is like a bolt from Zeus that you can't do anything about, and you just sort of, it comes and then suddenly there are billionaires. It isn't. It is something that we get to direct, because that level of ingenuity is fundamentally a human value. I think there are, so really I'm very explicit with that and agree with Nico entirely. But there are some underlying elements to the process that are that feel to me much more likely to happen. So, for example, we'll tend to try to find shortcuts. We'll tend to try to, use a little less resource if we can. I mean, I'm not saying anything about waste. I'm talking about the resource the maker has to pay for. And that we will learn from each other. And in the act of learning from each other, we will learn more quickly. So, I'm definitely not a technology determinist. I think it's a force that we can channel in the way that Nico describes. But within that, so long as we have the freedom to experiment and exchange, I think things have this habit of sort of moving forward. And should I take the second point as well? Or
go ahead, and then I've got a follow-up.
Yeah, so on the question of the previous monopolies, there are always parallels in history, but there is something different about the nature of these particular companies and the scale that they have that makes them a little bit harder to get your hands around. So, for example, in some sense, we knew what the market that Standard Oil was in was, right? It was oil, and they had managed to get hold of things up and downstream, but they didn't necessarily get involved in other businesses. When you look at the power that Facebook or Amazon has, it's a little bit judged by this Potter Stewart, who talked about pornography, right? I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it. Economists find it really hard to come up with an economic definition of the market that Amazon or Apple seems to dominate, yet we all feel they kind of dominate our lives in some way. So they fail, they pass the kind of that test, the is it sort of yucky test, they don't necessarily pass an economist's test. And so I didn't want to get bogged down too much into the sort of specific definitions, rather than to point out that there is a kind of a power that is emerging, and that when you start to get power that emerges that is unchecked, as the founding fathers of the US knew only too well when they created the Constitution, you need to find checks and balances towards it. So in a strict sense, yes, you can argue that they're not exact monopolies, but they are sort of certainly. I mean, I dare anyone to tell me what the third biggest search engine in the US is.
Anyone?
Yeah.
Please, by the way, weigh in with questions or points from the room, and I'll come to you in a second. But there's an interesting part, I think, at the end of your book, where you end effectively on an optimistic note, saying we are still in control of this process. And I just wonder, though, if you look at certain companies and where they are on the exponential curve, are you worried that with certain companies and in certain sectors, we might, if we don't take action, lose that opportunity and actually get out of control?
Well, I think that we have a showdown coming up. When I first started to write my newsletter, I remember about 6 months into it, so 2016, I sat down with some investors, and I was talking about Facebook's market cap and Apple's market cap, and it was about $500 billion at the time. Apple, which is now $2.5 trillion. And I said, where do you think Apple will be in 5 years? Nobody could conceive of $1 trillion in this group of 20 people market cap. Incidentally, nor could I. Otherwise, I would have put all my money in Apple. And it's now at $2.5 trillion. And if you look at the growth of these businesses, it is still crazy. I mean, Amazon hired 1.3 million people in the last 18 months. So I think that they will continue to grow. There was a story in the FT today that pointed out that the rate of acquisitions made by the biggest technology companies is higher now, even with all this regulatory scrutiny, than it was last year or the year before, $264 billion spent. So they continue to expand their sort of frontier. Now, I think that, by the way, if you're them, that makes sense, because you know that there's going to be a showdown coming. And you know that the showdown will have a baseline. It'll be like, well, how big are you right now when we come in to implement this regulatory settlement? And if you start getting all meek and mild and stop growing, you'll get pegged further back than if you get very expansive. So they're at different points. But I also don't think the risk is just about these particular companies and their scale. They're the ones that are most manifest. I mean, there are other risks that we have to contend with that are sort of embedded in the argument.
So, I mean, just in terms of danger and the threat that some of these companies pose to some of the social institutions that you talk about in your book, obviously how fast a company is growing is one big element of it, but another element is presumably what that company does. And are you worried about a specific company in terms of its specific threat to the kind of institutions that you feel should be bolstered and protected in the ways that you've described?
Well, I'm worried about. You want me to give you a specific one? I gather from the question. I mean, I'm concerned about the novel behaviours that companies can now engage in because of what's enabled by the technology that we perhaps hadn't thought about when we agreed what good behaviour looked like. And I think that's where we have to keep our, sort of keep looking. And I'll give you a sort of perhaps a slightly kind of curious example of this. So as we went into the early stages of the pandemic, there was this discussion about contact tracing apps on the phones. And you may remember there was a big kerfuffle about governments wanting centralized contact tracing apps and civil liberties people saying, well, if you're centralizing in the government, and that means the Home Secretary knows exactly who's met who, that's really like a reversion of our human rights. And we could achieve the public health outcomes with a decentralized system. So it's a system that will warn me when I'm next to someone who's got COVID, but it won't tell Priti Patel that I was in the Bricklayer's Arms on a Thursday night when I should have been at home. And so what's very interesting about that was that the governments were dependent on the providers of the key mobile operating systems, Google for Android and Apple for iOS, in order to enable this effectively. And those companies came out and said, we're going to create what's known as an SDK. It's a software library on these operating systems for contact tracing, and it will be enabled in billions of phones, but it'll only be decentralized. In other words, it won't allow your sort of police services to access to the stuff that they really want. Now, from a rights perspective, a sort of human rights person, civil liberties person, you might be delighted with that outcome, right? But from a process perspective, like how should things like this be governed? You might feel a bit kind of heebie-jeebie, right? Because it's been some Silicon Valley execs, and maybe there were Shenzhen execs, right, who had been a different operating system, have decided the limits of this particular kind of public health initiative. Now, we might all feel, well, that's great, because actually I feel safer that it was decentralized. But that, to me, is a kind of area we have to have a really, really critical debate about where should those decisions get made and how should they get made. And frankly, when I talk about the exponential gap, do our elected officials, even if they had the powers, have the capabilities to ask the right questions in this sort of area?
Okay, there are a couple of questions from the floor. Can we come to you, sir? Oh, wait, if you don't mind just waiting for the mic. Thanks.
So Azeem gave a diplomatic answer. I will give you a rude answer to your question. It seems to me that if you think of the big tech companies, Facebook stands out as the evil player. If you think of a world without super efficient search, we don't want that. So, Google has its upside. Netflix streaming makes people happy. wonderfully efficient delivery of e-commerce purchases from Amazon, great. All of these companies may be monopolistic, maybe too powerful. You know, the App Store, maybe Epic is right to fight Apple on the 30% tariff, right? So you can criticize the others, but I think on net, society is surely better off. Facebook is the one, if you've read the 5-part series in the Wall Street Journal last week, where I think you're starting to feel it's big tobacco, that, you know, this is not a public good, this is a public bad, that they are peddling a combination of sort of fostering of extremism in political debate, teen depression, and so forth. So
yeah,
throw that out there.
Azeem, just before you respond to that point, and then we'll bring in James, our co-founder, in a second. But can I just ask, do you think that it's possible to run a social media company for 2 billion plus people without facing the sort of issues that have been exposed by the Wall Street Journal last week? Like, how much of that problem that we're seeing is inherent in running a social media company?
Well, I think the power of the Wall Street Journal series is that it shows that the company itself knew about these problems and chose not to do anything. And indeed, it wasn't just somebody at the mid-level of the company. Some of this stuff, as I recall, was prepared as memos to be presented to Mark Zuckerberg. So he cannot claim he didn't know. So I feel like that answers your question. There is a way of doing it better. They had the choice to do it better, and they chose quite clearly not to. And one of the things that really made me angry about them was this notion that as they felt pressure to take down malicious content in the rich democracies, they deliberately pivoted and spread what they were doing in poor countries where they wouldn't get pushback. Likewise, the point about their VIP exceptions program, which, by the way, is not a few tens of thousands of people, it's millions of people who are on this list. They can make people take down nudes, but they choose not to if you are a soccer star. It's a choice. To the earlier point that Azeem was making, technology doesn't force you to do this. So yeah, 2 billion people on your platform, 3 billion people on your platform, there's going to be stuff that happens. But I think we've seen with Facebook that they're not really trying very hard to stop that stuff happening.
Azeem, do you want to respond? And then we'll come to James and whoever else wants to make a point.
Obviously, I'm in book promotion mode, and Facebook has 200,000 employees, all of whom read books, I understand. So Sebastian was able to kind of cut through to the chase. What I would say, but more seriously, though, is that you know, the Wall Street Journal and many others have identified really sort of terrible corporate behavior, sort of human behavior by the management team of Facebook. And it's been reported for quite a long time. And I talk about, you know, the Rohingya in my book and a couple of other examples. But I think that there's a more fundamental question, which is, what is it to be a private company and to behave well when you find yourself owning public infrastructure and therefore transmitting your values out in through the actual code that exists on the site? And you know, example I give to that is, you know, when you register on Facebook, which we all did at some point in the past, you get asked about your relationship status, and it's sort of, you know, married, single, dating, divorce.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, right? And when my mum finally got on Facebook, she just joined LinkedIn this week. By the way, guys, it's time to leave LinkedIn. But when my mum got on Facebook, she kind of pulled me up, and she has, at the time, she's a 70-plus-year-old Muslim woman, and said, what does this, it's complicated mean? And the thing is, it's complicated existed in a Harvard dorm room in 2004. It doesn't exist in large parts of the world. It certainly doesn't exist in Pakistan or Myanmar or India or a whole bunch of other places. And yet the idea of the coder becomes law. It becomes the reality, and we have no way of testing that. So, you know, Sebastian is absolutely right, and his beautiful articulation of the kind of really terrible sort of human decisions that were made by the management team. But I think there's a more fundamental question, which is when these sort of private entities start to spill into the public space and start to privatize even personal relationships, can one actually behave well in those circumstances, or do we have to look at those questions in different ways?
We'll come back to potential solutions in a second, but James, do you want to make a point?
Yeah, I did. Azeem, thank you for doing this. And Sebastian, we don't live quite in the Zoom world, so we don't have Sebastian Malaby's name. But when your book comes out, I think at the beginning of January, we'd like to get this gang back together and have the conversation again. I wanted to ask you, and I sort of emote really a concern about the relationship between the exponential age and liberalism. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get your sense of what you think the relationship is, because I understand Sebastian's point that says, look, we've got a specific Facebook problem. But if it turns out that actually what we've got is the beginning of a series of failures of the state in the face of privately held powers, how is that going to work out? If crypto does to finance what in effect social media has done to the media, if AI does to the world of privacy and data and surveillance, what we've seen in the information marketplace, then I think that what we're going to see is a wholesale assault on the idea of liberalism, that people who believe in freedom and who are instinctively intrigued and excited by the future find that they've been bystanders to the destruction of the system that they believe in. And I'm interested to know what you think the exponential age does to essentially the political philosophy that enabled it.
It's a beautiful observation. Alexei, James asked a question. Am I allowed to respond? You said
he's broken his own rules.
He's broken his own rules. Okay, James, I'm gonna come back.
You can do whatever you want.
Just keep an eye on that. In a funny way, the exponential age has eaten one of its children previously. So I think it's really the technologies and the way they play out. I talk about this in chapter 6 of the book. Are also eating some of the arguments behind globalization, and so not unreasonable to say what happens with liberalism. And I think one of the reasons we've ended up getting here is that we bought into the idea of the determinism of technology, and that it sort of marches forward like a train, rolls forward like a very fast train, and if you don't get on, you get left behind. And so we didn't engage in the political discussion that needed to happen early enough. And part of writing a book that I hope is readable but to both technologists and to non-technologists is to give people the tools to have that conversation, because I don't have a great theory more than I have a hope, which is that the broader the group of people who are able to participate and have conversations and ask the right questions, the more we can actually shape these technologies in ways that are broadly beneficial. I mean, when you look at a book that came out last year or the year before, Caroline Perez's book, Invisible Women, part of the argument is that there was a whole bunch of people who were not involved in the conversations about how these technologies and products are brought to market, women, and therefore are not represented in the sort of power differential that sometimes the technologies express. And so I don't have a better answer at this point than to say, I mean, one can say, well, look, historically, when there have been these technology shifts, things get complicated, there's a call to populists. And that to me feels a bit pessimistic, rather than saying, to paraphrase, the exponential is political. And if you are tooled up, you can ask the right questions and you can participate in the process and you can influence in the way that you influence. Because if you don't, what you end up with is what I think we've seen, which is a very, very simple mantra where we become the takers of the technology rather than the shapers of that technology.
But even if governments do get better, they do have better capabilities, isn't the power gap just going to widen?
Well, but, it's not just about government, it's also about people. And in my day job, I invest in early stage companies, like sort of founders trying to figure things out. And there is something that's shifted in the last 4 or 5 years that is a kind of groundswell. There are two things. First is lots of founders in traditionally data-rich businesses like the sort of fintech, the intersection of finance and technology, now say, we're building a privacy-safe system. we're building a system that serves a customer, but we don't have access to the personal data, and it's kind of sort of cryptographically secure. That didn't happen 5 or 6 years ago, and it's now going to become embedded in the values of those systems. The other thing that has shifted is just the sheer number of founders who say, I understand technologies and how to bring them to market and how to make them grow. I'm going to focus on technologies that suck carbon out of the atmosphere or that help regenerate soil. And that is a value shift, not an economic shift. I mean, Milton Friedman doesn't have an explanation as to why they're behaving like that, right, in a way. And so it's not just about governments, but I do think it is about a much wider engagement with this force that is ours to direct.
Okay, can we come to you, sir, and then we'll come to the man in the green shirt.
Yep. Thanks, Azeem. And actually, it's quite a nice segue into what I was going to say, actually. Firstly, thank you for ruining my summer. You did a brilliant podcast at the end of your bonus edition, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry of the Future. Gave me a healthy dose of realism, I think. I've always been a sort of technology optimist. I think most people in this room probably are. I just don't think that, and it follows on from what you were saying, I just think that applying this exponential age and the technologies you're saying to a broader societal thing, I just think it's I look at some of the people we work with, it's very, very difficult to take legacy businesses and transition them into this future. And I just think that I mean, I say the end of that podcast, basically, I think Stan says that, you know, his timing was off. It was what he thought was 2040 is actually going to be 2010. I'm not ruining the book for anybody, but that to me is the fundamental problem. We've had COVID come into this as well, and just everything is going to get clogged up.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the point of legacy businesses, it is really difficult. And I did have to take out the one example of a legacy business that has transitioned really well, just for reasons of brevity. But I will share what it is. It's John Deere, the company that makes tractors and combine harvesters, which in 2011 turned themselves into a data-centric business. But in doing so, they made a tremendous return for their shareholders and pissed off every farmer in America. So there you go. It's a Facebook story on the fields. I think I have, in fact, weirdly, I have one slide that came in with me in my bag. We're not allowed PowerPoint, but I'll hold it up. And the second
rule breach tonight.
Yeah, sorry. This slide is really relevant to your question because on the left-hand column, I have the age of steam, and I copied a tweet from a friend called Horace Dediu, and he says, the 19th century saw explosive growth in mobility through the mass adoption of steam power. You could travel around the world in 80 days, and yet none of the steam titans, the rail and ship magnates, barons, industrialists, capitalists, had any part in creating automotive mobility, which of course arrived in the 1880s and 1890s. So there is one part of this story that has rhymed previously, and you know, I think many legacy businesses will struggle to transition.
Azeem, we're going to come to the gentleman in the green shirt in a second, and then Ash Fontana is making a point online. But I just wanted to ask you quickly, just following up on James's point. You write really fascinatingly in the book about globalization and the relationship between globalization and exponential tech development. And there's this really interesting kind of thesis that the more advanced tech gets and the better that 3D printing gets, the more incentive there will be to move away from globalization and away from global supply chains and towards like localized manufacturing. How much of that are we seeing, and how disruptive is that shift?
Well, I think it's a headwind rather than a U-turn in that sense. And just to provide some context, if you think about energy, you know, energy has been about sort of shipping liquefied natural gas and oil from sort of dangerous parts of the world to rich parts of the world, and so the US built a big navy and stationed it in the Straits of Hormuz for 50 years. But new energy is solar power, and whereas the richest countries for oil have 1 million times more oil per square mile than the poorest, the richest companies for sunlight, Azerbaijan and Armenia, only have 4 times as much solar insolation as the poorest country, which is the Norwegians. And so you change that dynamic. You also change it when it comes to food through technologies like cellular agriculture and vertical farms, which can, you know, essentially kind of soon with quite a degree of intensity, create the food that you need locally. And you may start to do so with 3D printing, which is this sort of very niche technology right now. All of them argue for a greater ability to produce what you need near its point of consumption. And so a lower need to have these enormous supply chains, and the fact that when you order a tomato on Tesco online on a Thursday, it's probably still in the ground in another country, and you know, for your Sunday delivery. And what I would say as well is that we've also seen in this strategic competition of technology, alongside that, this desire to break these supply chains apart. And this was happening well before COVID showed up, but you know, essentially every single silicon chip in the world, bar a handful, was made either in Taiwan or in Korea, using technology from a Dutch company. And in the last 3 to 4 years, and slightly longer for China, you know, the Chinese have said, we want semiconductor independence. The Americans have started to build chip factories in the US. The Europeans, Thierry, I'm going to say Mugler, but I don't mean that, Thierry Breton, has sort of talked about wanting to have a European semiconductor industry. Mm-hmm. So there is a bunch of different forces that are starting to say, actually, we want this more local, and it plays, frankly, to many of the political currents as well, which, you know, is not my expertise.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman in the green shirt.
We've been talking a lot about the use of technologies in kind of Western liberal economies, in which I think there is lots of cause for optimism, but there is, you know, an undeniable ability for these same exponential technologies to really enhance the power of authoritarian regimes. You know, mm-hmm. We saw the other day, Apple and Google both removed kind of counter-protests app from the Russian market. Obviously, yeah. China's use of facial recognition is well documented. I mean, can we really be as optimistic about the use of these same technologies and the exponential age in these authoritarian countries, where it seems, if anything, their power has really been strengthening?
It's a great observation, and you definitely saw for a moment a lot of discussion about how surveillance technology was being exported by Chinese vendors like ZTE, places like Ecuador and so on. And let's not forget NSO Group out of Israel. There are, I suppose, two sides to this. You know, the other side is that in many parts of the world, you know, people are poor and they don't have healthcare and they don't have adequate energy, and these technologies drive down the prices of those things and make those fundaments to human welfare broadly available. And that even in the more repressive regimes, you know, North Korea, there is a leaking, there is a direction of travel. And so again, perhaps I'm a sort of hopeless optimist about this question, but the creating sort of food security and then wealth and then educational opportunities in a population often creates a population that's rather harder to control. And I think that is sometimes the juggling act that you see, you know, in China. I mean, we have to put the sort of the attacks on the Uyghurs just to one side for a moment, but you know, even the social credit scheme that's running in China is not so much a tool of control at this point as it is trying to make up for the fact that there's an enormous trust deficit between institutions of all types in China, you know, because of the regularity with which previous regimes have come in and sort of swept away l'ancien, right? And there's no sense of continuity. So I think it's.
But it could quickly turn into a tool with control, right?
Well, I mean. It might, you know, it might, but I think it's harder than people. It's harder than people imagine. We have to stand up against it. So the fact that the Indian National Railways a few weeks ago announced they were going to put facial recognition on to sort of count passengers ostensibly, and then there's this little coda that says it will also find lost children, which is always the way to kind of win the equivalent of the Daily Mail hearts in any country, and petty criminals, and you realise, wait, there's some scope creep there, you know, mission creep. So that's why you need to have civil society and rights groups standing up and arguing against these things on a kind of ongoing and continuous basis. But it's back to the point that these technologies aren't miraculous. They're tools and used by humans, and we're the ones who have to figure out that balance.
Isn't that an example of where we might not be in control, or at least where a state might be in control, but the citizens who are affected by the technology are not in control?
There are not many examples yet where there is really, really, widespread, detailed monitoring of entire populations with any degree of accuracy, except for those of us who are still using Facebook products, right, when we're monitored the whole time. There are cases of, extreme behavior. So the use of, the way that NSO's technologies was used to find activists and so on. And so this idea of there being a deep police state that is enabled by surveillance technology, I think is more fanciful than the ideas of, I've forgotten his surname, Adam, the amazing BBC documentary maker who makes those 4-hour Curtis's, latest documentary, right, where it's really more about a sort of systemic question and the kind of malaise of capitalism that leads us down that rabbit hole.
A couple more comments, one from you, sir, and one from Ash Fontana. But just to follow up on that for 1 second. Hold on, Ash is going to come in a second. How do you know? So you could say 3D printing, for instance, is on an exponential curve, but it's at the beginning of it.
Yeah.
Why is 3D printing at the beginning of an exponential curve and police state surveillance not also at the beginning of an exponential curve?
That's a good question. So 3D printing is just, it's taken some science, and now it's taken a lot of different bits of an industry to figure out how to improve the quality, the speed, the accuracy of these printers. And what we can do now is quite impressive. One of my friends actually works in a building that was 3D printed out of, it's a big building, and he's a tall guy. It's like 3,000 square feet. It's 3D printed out of concrete. And so you are starting to see that becoming more commonplace. If you think about the police state question, what you actually have is still a coordination issue. You have to coordinate lots and lots of people. There's lots of infrastructure that you have to get to work, that you need to sort of put cameras on streets and figure out how to get into lots of people's phones. And humans are required, and it only takes a few to be a bit slack, or a few to have some sort of sense of some qualms, and you run into the process getting slower and slower. So I think it's not an exponential process in the way that it's a sort of engineering iteration around 3D printing is.
Ash, sorry to keep you waiting.
All good, I'll keep it quick and very focused. Hey Azeem, what's the single best framework you've seen for regulating companies with some sort of runaway competitive advantage based on such an exponential technology? And you may disagree with that premise, and if not a framework, just one author, one researcher, one book that's really seriously considering how to regulate such companies and technologies.
I'm not allowed to mention mine.
Yours is good.
Yeah, yours is good. I enjoyed yours as well, Ash. So very practical if you're building AI-first companies. I think the commonality behind these runaway companies is the idea of the network effect, that they have this externality. As more people use them, they get more and more powerful. So can you find some way of weakening the network effect? And the argument that I make in the book is that you can do that through the idea of interoperability. The idea of interoperability is that in the same way that I can send an SMS text message as an EE subscriber to someone on an O2 network, that didn't used to be the case. 20 years ago, you could only send SMSs to people who are on the same network as you, and it was an absurdity. And so interoperability would allow us to move not just our data, but our actual full experience from network to network. And I think the people who argue for this in the most compelling fashion, and are sort of referred to in the book, are the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US, and there's a science fiction writer who spent some time in London actually called Cory Doctorow, who has an idea of that he calls adversarial interoperability. And I think if you had to do one thing, it would be to say, we're going to have to mandate interoperability, even if it comes at some putative cost to the level of innovation that Google or Facebook claim they can do.
That's a really clear recommendation. So sorry to keep you waiting.
Hi, Azeem. Thanks for the Ministry of the Future recommendation as well. I read it and it was fantastic.
Did I recommend my book to you?
You may have done. I haven't read that one yet, so apologies if this is in the book and I'm just a little bit late. So I think the comment about Facebook and the worry and that being part of this exponential age, I think is valid and something I've certainly thought about as well. But the real exponential curve I'm worried about is climate change, and seeing temperatures are not increasing in a linear fashion, they're increasing in an exponential fashion. And nature, of course, has done exponential for millennia. I mean, and usually in S-curves where we're flipping from one state to another. So I think that what I'm trying to get my head around is, why are we so bad at exponential thinking? You saw it with COVID, you see it with climate change, you see it with the predictions that your investor friends made on Apple. And why is linear thinking kind of so inherent to everything we do? And lastly, I think we all want to hear what you think Apple's valuation will be in 5 years' time.
Yeah, good. But that's a hard challenge. I do talk about why we are bad at exponential thinking in chapter 3. It's not a particularly well researched area in the academy, and the argument seems to boil down to something to do with nature, which is that through the evolutionary process, there's been no benefit in being able to understand an exponential process, because you don't see them in the real world, and we've only really started to see them in the last 50 to 60 years. So we are ill-suited to figure out even the first order estimates. And I felt slightly unsatisfied with that answer. I think I write it in quite a funny way in the book. On the question of climate change, I don't want to pretend that technology will be sufficient to answer this question, because it is a problem of collective action and collective will, but I think it is quite helpful. So just take a look at what's happened in many, many economies, from the UK to Uzbekistan, and sort of many in between. Over the past 20 years, the exact data is in the book, but British GDP has increased by, let's call it 70% for sake of argument. I can't remember the real number. But the amount of electricity we've generated in order to drive that economic welfare has declined significantly. So we use less energy to create economic welfare. That's the thing that we measure as a success of our societies. We've also rapidly decarbonized. So we use about 50% less carbon to produce every kilowatt hour of electricity today than we did 20 years ago. So we have figured out, through some of these technologies, to essentially create less waste for an increasing amount of, let's call it goodness, if GDP is, that's what GDP is. No, even if you take the supply chain costs of pushing stuff out to other parts of the world, but that in of itself isn't enough, right? So there's an old sort of diktat called the Jevons paradox, which was sort of identified in the 1850s, which simply said is, if you've got a messy wardrobe and so you buy a second wardrobe, that wardrobe will be super messy within a week. And that's just the way it is. And that's the Jevons paradox, and it's the paradox of our behavior. Even as we make these things more efficient, we may still consume so much more that we create even more waste. So my take on the climate change question is that we are really lucky that we have these technologies to help us tackle this monumentally difficult problem, but that is not sufficient. And what worries me is that there'll be some technocratic wishful thinking that will say, we can just wait because nuclear fusion is just going to be here and that will sort all our problems out. And so the thing that we have to do is we have to still do the hard work, even though we are making progress with some of these technologies. As for Apple, I expect it will be worth a lot more in 5 years' time than it is now. Yeah, I mean, I really would. And much, much more, because...
Do you have a number?
I can't. I'm not a regulated investment advisor, but I think the ability of the company to continue to expand into new markets and to make this move towards services, suddenly I sound like a financial analyst, just means that it will continue to grow. When you look at something like Facebook, I think there's a different question there, to Sebastian's point, right, about how it might get regulated, but it's still an incredible fast-moving company from that perspective, so hard to call it.
We are a little bit over time, but
sorry about that.
No, not at all. I just wanted to ask you one more question, though, because it seems like we've got a really kind of clear-eyed summary of where we are now. But if we're on an exponential curve, things are presumably going to accelerate even faster in the years ahead.
Yeah.
And your suggestions for how to strengthen institutions, transparency, interoperability, and a few others, seem to apply quite well to where we are now on the curve. But you also say in 10 years' time, a computer might have 100 trillion connections, and in 10 years' time, the price of computing will be 100 times less. So is there a danger that the sort of solutions you're presenting are good for now, but are quickly going to be overtaken by exactly the sort of problem that you're outlining?
I mean, when I get to the sort of end of the book, I identify 3 design principles that I think are important for this period of time. And you're absolutely right. It's not just that computers are going to get cheaper, but take, for example, connected devices. There are about 50 billion devices, from phones and cameras, connected to the internet. What will that number be in 10 years? I mean, it could be 1 trillion, right? And in 20 years, it could certainly be 10 trillion. So I identify 3 principles which I would put against the ones that we've used over the last 50 years, which have primarily been around efficiency. And those principles are the idea of commonality. So where are there common goods and common approaches to resource allocation and governance? And that might range from everything from open source to us securely sharing health data to get better health outcomes. The second is the idea of resilience. So how do we design systems that are resilient by design, rather than bolting the resilience into them afterwards? And the resilience has not been something boards of companies have been willing to invest in for many years, until March 2020, when it became important. And then the third design principle is the principle of flexibility. So a sense that we're in a terrain which is uncertain, so you need to be able to explore the terrain and explore potentials rather than just exploit potentials. And so those 3 principles, commonality, resilience, and flexibility, I think are things that you can use as prompts to figure out what your behaviors need to be. And I mean, we can come back in 20 years and when we're still waiting for self-driving taxis and see if I was right.
Okay, well, that's a great note to end on. Normally, I would do a little summing up, but the only thing I'm going to say is this book is great, and go outside and buy a copy. And thank you so much for coming along tonight, and thanks to everyone who attended online. We are really fascinated at Tortoise about big tech. We've got a weekly newsletter that is called Tech States, because our fundamental thinking on this subject is that these tech companies are not merely corporate entities. There's something else. There's something bigger and more influential, and we've got to look at them in a fundamentally different way. So if anyone has any thoughts, email me. Otherwise, thank you so much, Azeem, for coming along.